Hello. In the last video, I talked to you about conceptualization and operationalization. How do we think about measurement in comparative politics, essentially? What I'm going to do in this video is apply those concepts to data that you could find online. To begin with, I wanted to talk to you about the different types of data sets and information about countries you can find online. There are two main types. Some data sets are provided by non-governmental organizations. Transparency International and their Corruption Perceptions Index is one example. Freedom House and its scores for freedom in the world are another example. And the one I'm going to walk through with you is the Fragile States Index, but we'll get there in a second. These data sets tend to be updated yearly, and they tend to be part of the NGO's advocacy agenda. They very commonly don't have great methodologies, or at least aren't very clear about how they put the scores together, but despite that fact, they're often very widely used. The other type of data set available online is more academic. These can also vary really widely, from the Varieties of Democracy dataset, which has a lovely website and is built by a multi-university consortium. The Worldwide Governance Indicators are another example of an academic quality data set available online. Not all academic data is super fancy, though. Sometimes they'll have very simple websites. This is a data set that we'll use when we talk about democratization, put together by 3 scholars who categorized authoritarian regimes into, are they monarchies, are they military regimes, things along those lines. Sometimes these data sets are available through data repositories, and the Harvard Dataverse is actually the most commonly used one. So what I'm going to do now is walk you through how to find information on one of these websites and point you to the different types of information you should look for before you start using the data. This is the Fragile States Index. It's one of the NGO-produced data sets available online about state fragility and stability. The first two things that you want to focus on when you look at a data set are conceptualization and operationalization. Again, with conceptualization, we're talking about how are you defining the terms. So what is state fragility and how are they actually measuring that? So the first thing to be aware of with this data set is that they don't actually provide you a definition of what state fragility is. What they do is give a series of indicators, add up scores for each of those indicators, and then produce a score and a ranking for whatever state fragility actually is. They do provide more information on the indicators themselves. They've divided state fragility into 4 different dimensions: cohesion, economy, politics, and society, and then have looked at 3 indicators for each of those dimensions. If we then look at one of the indicators in particular, public services, for example, they provide more detail as well. They provide a brief overview of what they mean by that particular indicator or the concept of the indicator. In this case, public services is the presence of basic state functions that serve the people. And then they've provided a series of questions that you could ask to get at what this actually means for a country. Do people have access to medicines? Is the sanitation system adequate? Things along those lines. So when you're assessing whether or not this is a high-quality data set and whether or not this is data that you actually want to use, you need to use your judgment when looking at these indicators and these definitions. Are these the right questions to ask about the availability of public services? Do they bias this indicator in one particular direction or another? Are there things that are missing from this indicator? Are these the right dimensions of state fragility? And are these the right indicators for each dimension? So the next thing you want to think about is operationalization. So this is where we focus in on measurement. There are 3 things that you want to think about when you think about operationalization in a data set like this. First, what exactly are the indicators, the specific variables that they're using, which we can see right here. Second, what is the methodology? How do they actually come up with the scores for these indicators, and how do they combine those scores into one single number? And third, you want to think about how they've actually chosen to present the data. Is it a 3-category score? Is it a 1 to 10 scale? What do the numbers actually mean? And I've already gone over the indicators. Now we'll look at the methodology for the Fragile States Index. What the Fund for Peace has provided here is a description of why they use a particular methodology, and then this is where they get into what they actually do. Now, this methodology has some strengths and some weaknesses. What they describe here is a 3-stage process for how they get information. They actually have a commercial content aggregator scrape the web to get media articles about a bunch of different countries, and then do a content analysis of what those articles are saying. They also use a bunch of different quantitative data from pre-existing statistical sources, and then they have social science researchers reviewing the data and making assessments. The fact that they're using these different types of information and a wide range of information is actually really good. But the big weakness of this particular methodology is that you don't actually know where they're getting the information from, how the commercial content aggregator is getting their data, what the actual data sets that they're using for statistical analysis, who the social science researchers are, how many are there, what is their level of expertise, things along those lines. We're missing a lot of detail on exactly how they've gathered their information, and there's very little information then on how that information is translated into the number that they're using for their score. As noted, the last thing you want to think about when you look at operationalization is what information exactly they're giving you. So here, got a 0 to 10 score for each indicator, and then they're added into a single score for a country and presented in terms of order rank. This is a very common method used by NGOs in their scoring and ranking because, again, the whole point of these type of data sets is usually to highlight increases and decreases, strengths and weaknesses of countries and to promote change. But one of the assessments that you need to make is this the right way to actually think about state fragility? Is state fragility just a basic, okay, let's add up how strong their security apparatus is with the level of economic inequality and the overall legitimacy of the state, and when we add it all together, that's what is telling us is a fragile state or not? You could make the argument yes, but you could also make the argument no. Again, this is where you're using your judgment and your knowledge of the broader context to assess whether or not this is quality data or something that you might not actually want to use. The final 2 things you want to look at when you're looking at data sets is the complete and utter practical aspect of it. What is the scope of the data, and how do you actually access that data? So when I'm talking about the scope of the data, what I'm talking about is what years are covered and what countries are covered for each year. So here, if you go to download data, you can see that the Fragile States Index has information going back to 2006 up to the current year. They don't have a single page within their website that tells you which countries are covered for which years, which is actually something fairly standard most people will present. But if you open up any of these individual files, you can see here they offer you a standard format for both 2006 and 2020. But as you can see, in 2006, they only covered 147 countries, and in 2020, they have 179 countries. So these are things that you want to ask questions about when you're thinking about scope. The other thing that I wanted to highlight here in this Fragile States Index is that they are offering you a change from the previous year. Essentially they subtracted last year's score from this year's score, and oh look, they've gotten worse. But they're providing no context for this. There's no standard error. There's no confidence interval around this. So you don't know whether or not this minus 1.1 actually means anything. Is that within the error for what these numbers mean? Or is that actually a significant decline? The final thing that you want to note, and this is not usually a big deal for NGO written data sets, is what format the data is available in. Here, one of the big reasons I don't actually use the Fragile States Index, I don't like their methodology, but more importantly, they actually only provide a single Excel file for every year. They don't have what's called a time series cross-national data set, where they've provided every year and every country that they have information for. It makes the data extremely just difficult to use. I want to contrast this here with an academic data set, just to show you some of the other things that you can look for when you're looking for data. This is a data set of elections that take place in dictatorships. And academic data sets will almost always have one thing that you're going to find super helpful, and that's called the codebook. It offers you the title of the data set, the authors, a list of variables. NELDA, this is a horrible data set because their variables lack meaning. It's much more user-friendly when instead of, oh, this is NELDA 2, they actually say, oh, that's the number of elections they've had since the country was founded, or whatever that variable actually is. But they'll let you know what all the variables in the data set are, and then they will, in the text itself, describe what these variables actually mean and how they got that information. Sometimes it's a simple yes-no question. Were these the first multi-party elections? Sometimes with cross-national data sets, they will actually provide you data sources for each country that they're working with. They don't do that in this particular case. It would get a little cumbersome, but that's the type of information you can often find. Here, what they do instead is offer you examples of yes, no, and special cases where they didn't actually follow the coding rules the way they thought they would. Academic data sets will also do something that's called intercoder reliability. The challenge of having specialists, social science researchers, make judgment calls about what's going on in a country is that sometimes different people view data in different ways, and they'll see the same series of events but draw different conclusions from it. And sometimes people just make mistakes. So well-constructed data sets will have more than one person go over the same exact information and then compare the results of those two people to each other. So in this particular case, the authors have provided information on how often the two separate coders, the two separate people who looked at the data and made decisions about it, were in agreement with each other. As a data set, NELDA, the one that we're looking at right now, does not actually provide you any aggregate information. They are not providing you a single variable that means something like democracy or state fragility. But academic data sets that do that will often give you the equations or the specific formula used in order to produce that number. To give you an example of this, I will click really quickly on the varieties of democracy dataset. First off, I'll just highlight their reference material here. You'll see that it's extremely extensive. Not only do they have a code book, and that code book's like 100 pages long, they've also got information on the organization itself. They've got a very detailed methodology on how they put all their variables together. Clicking on the code book here, since this is a 400-page document, I'm just going to skip to an example. So here's an example of an aggregate index, one for electoral democracy or polyarchy, as they define it here. Here, they're describing what they actually mean by polyarchy, which is very similar to Dahl's version of it. And then they describe exactly how they aggregate it. What subvariables that they have created themselves, what they combine into a polyarchy score. And then they give you an equation. Since what they're producing is a number, they give you an equation for how they actually combine those things together. It's a weighted average, in other words. So those are the main things that I wanted to talk to you about in terms of finding data online. You're going to practice this in a scavenger hunt with a small group and learn a lot more about this data and information that you can available over the course of the semester. Thank you.